Good evening, everyone. It's Ophir Tal again, the Israeli emissary on behalf of the Jewish Agency for Israel at the Foreign Trade Y. Tonight, we are making a very special event in favor of Yom Haatzmaut and Yom HaZikaron, which is Israeli Independence Day, and also the memorial for fallen soldiers and victims of terrorism. It's literally one day after the other. And also, as you might aware, the pandemic hit all of the world, Israel included. And we have a very special guest with us tonight, an award-winning Israeli journalist who lives in Washington, D.C. He's the correspondent of Haaretz in Washington, D.C., covering both Israel and the United States and the relations between the countries. And he's going to talk with us a little bit about how Israel is dealing at the moment with the pandemic and what may be the plans ahead. So I'd like to introduce to you Amir Tibon.
Hello, hi, Erev Tov. Okay, hi. Good evening, Erev Tov. I hope everyone can hear me okay. Thank you for joining our broadcast this evening, and thank you, Ophir, for the introduction and for making this event happen. I have to say, on a personal level, Yom HaZikaron and Yom Haatzmaut are two very important days for many, many Israelis, but specifically in my family. I grew up in a military home in Israel. My father was in the military for 30 years. And some of my most powerful memories growing up from my childhood are from Yom HaZikaron, because every year on Yom HaZikaron, I would not go to school, and instead I would get up in the morning and put on a white t-shirt, because in Israel that's what you wear usually on Yom HaZikaron, just a white plain shirt. But instead of going to school, I would go with my father for a tour of the country. We would visit families that served under his command, that have lost their loved ones, and families that he became close to in the course of his service. And this was something that was really an important part of my childhood. Every year, this same tour, same group of families. And being now here in Washington, D.C., with my job as the Haaretz correspondent in Washington, I miss my home in Israel a lot, all the time, on different occasions. I miss my family and my friends and so many things that you miss from a place that is home. But specifically on Yom HaZikaron and Yom Haatzmaut, it's hard because all of those memories come back and you really do feel far away. But this year, I have to say, Yom HaZikaron is probably difficult and comes with a sense of loneliness for more people than usual. On usual years in Israel, Yom HaZikaron is very, very difficult for those who have lost loved ones, people who've lost family members and friends and others in the course of the country's wars and in terror attacks and all of those things that we are aware of that are just part of life in Israel. But at the same time, for many other Israelis, it's a sad day, but not very difficult, because the next day is already Yom Haatzmaut and people prepare for it, and you have parties and barbecues, and it's this really weird mixture of and combination between the 2 days, where you have on the one hand the saddest day of people mourning and grieving, and then the very next day, one of the happiest days, celebrating the independence, the foundation of our country. This year is particularly difficult, and as I said, comes with a sense of loneliness because, of course, of the coronavirus that has hit Israel like so many other countries around the world. There are some restrictions that are going to be in place this year for Yom HaZikaron and Yom Haatzmaut that a year ago would have sounded really unimaginable. The fact, for example, that tomorrow in Israel, it's in the morning, it's still Yom HaZikaron. The transformation from Yom HaZikaron to Yom Haatzmaut is only in the late afternoon, evening hours. But in the morning, usually, of Yom HaZikaron, the families who have lost their loved ones in the service in the IDF or in terror attacks go to the graves. This is what you do every year. You go to the cemetery, and then there is the siren at 11 a.m. And a lot of families want to be at that moment of the siren next to the grave of their loved one. But this year, they are forbidden from doing so. The government decided that in order to stop the spread of the virus in Israel, it's going to take an increasingly difficult decision to keep people away from the cemeteries on Yom HaZikaron. Personally, I'm not sure if this is actually the smartest and most efficient way. There are all kinds of arguments about what is efficient and what is inefficient in the fight against the virus. I've heard all kinds of opinions about the transmission of it outside in the air versus in closed areas. And I'm not an expert on any of it, so my opinion doesn't really matter. But I can tell you there is an argument, there is a debate about this in Israel because this is a very difficult decision. And then this is Yom HaZikaron, but after Yom HaZikaron comes Yom Haatzmaut, which is usually the time when people gather together and have parties and barbecues and celebrate, and one of the happiest days of the year. And that, of course, is also forbidden this year. No gatherings in Israel anywhere of more than just a small, maybe 4 or 5 people, basically a family that lives together. You're not going to be able to host friends or family members for Yom Haatzmaut. It's the same situation we had with Leil HaSeder just a few weeks ago. I think that when people celebrated Leil HaSeder, Passover, alone, just with their immediate family, it was difficult, but with Yom Haatzmaut, it might be even more difficult for a lot of secular Israelis, people who maybe are less religious, but Yom Haatzmaut is a big thing for them, and everybody waits all year long for the barbecue, and all the friends get together, and now you just don't have it. So very, very different atmosphere in Israel today compared to the usual situation we have around this time of the year. I do think, however, that things are going to change after Yom HaZikaron and Yom Haatzmaut. There are already signs coming from Israel that the reality around the coronavirus is changing, and I'm going to talk about that a little bit today. I'm going to speak for the next probably 20 minutes or so about what is happening in Israel with regards to the virus, how it's impacted the country, what steps have been taken. Maybe I'll try also to compare a little bit to what I'm seeing here in Washington, D.C. As an Israeli reporter covering America. A lot of times I look at both countries with a bit of a comparative eye. Of course, you cannot really compare a huge country of 300 million people to a tiny country of 9 million people. But still, as a journalist that comes from one country and is stationed in the other, you always have this sense of trying to say, oh, in Israel it's like this, here it's like that. So I also try to give a bit of that kind of taste when discussing what is going on in Israel regarding the coronavirus. First of all, some statistics. I'm looking now at the Haaretz website. They have a very good feature of a daily update of what is happening in Israel with the virus. So far in Israel, there have been 15,000 known cases of coronavirus. These are people who have been tested and found to be positive. Of course, just like in the United States, there are assessments in Israel that the actual number of people who have the virus is much higher than the 15,000 who have been tested and found to have it. Because you probably have a lot of people who have the virus and have very, very low symptoms of it, or maybe have no symptoms at all, and so they don't feel an urge to get tested, and it never really gets discovered that they actually had it. So that's one thing to take into consideration, but the official number right now is 15,000 cases in Israel, which for a country of 9 million people, not so bad. We are looking also at an encouraging trend in Israel over the past, I would even say 10 days, that there is overall a decrease in the number of new infections. When I say a decrease, just to be clear, it doesn't mean that there are less cases. The actual number of infections is larger than it was 10 days ago, but the rate of new infections per day has been consistently going down, except for one blip, I think, which was on April 22nd when there was suddenly a rise. The rest of the time it is going down. And yesterday there were 145 new infections, which if you compare to 10 days ago, you had almost 300. So that is a really important change that we are seeing. And in terms of the most unfortunate element of this disease, people who are dying, who are passing away, there have been 204 deaths in Israel from the coronavirus so far. The average death of the people who have died from the virus in Israel is 82 years old. 50% men, 50% women, almost completely the same. I know there were some countries where the doctors talked about a much higher percentage of men who died from the virus. In Israel, it's been half and half. And as I said, the average age of the people who died is 82. So just like in most other countries, the vast majority of people who have died from the virus are much older than the average of the population. But we also have had cases in Israel, and those cases have made the national news sometimes more, of people who are relatively younger who passed away. There was a woman, I think in her late 40s. There is a case that is now making headlines of an 11-year-old girl who is in urgent, she's in the ICU because of the virus. And as I said, maybe because the vast majority of the people who die are in their 70s, 80s, etc., the media, as it always does, fixates on the more rare cases that show the opposite, the younger people who are getting into very difficult situations because of it. One of the most important questions, of course, for any country and also for states in America when dealing with the virus is how many people are in a very difficult situation that requires hospitalization and ICU care. And actually on that front, there has been encouraging news in Israel because that number has been consistently going down for the last 10 days. If we look 10 days ago, we were at almost 200 people who needed that kind of treatment. Today, it's down to 126. That is a really important trend that shows that overall, the stress on the hospital system is going down. Now, putting aside the numbers, I can tell you a bit from a personal perspective. My younger brother, a hero, just amazing guy. He's a doctor who is currently working in one of the coronavirus departments in a large hospital in Israel. Of course, in the family, we're extremely proud of him, of my brother Uri, but at the same time, a bit worried because this is not an easy job to do. And he's a young, new doctor, just started working, and this is really one of the first things he gets to do. I tell him all the time, you will be able to tell everyone, decades ahead that your first real year as a doctor, you were working in the corona department. And he tells me unbelievable stories about the equipment they have to wear to work every day and the interactions they have with the patients. It's fascinating. But he's also been telling me that even in the department, specifically where he works, they have been feeling less and less pressure in the last few days, and that the numbers are going down, and there are less and less new patients. And all of that, of course, is good news for the country. However, this brings us to, and just one other really important number that unfortunately I think a lot of times the media outlets don't report on as much as they report on the other numbers I mentioned, the number of people who have recovered from the virus. And that number is rising all the time in Israel. 10 days ago, it was about 2,500 people who have recovered. Today, it's more than 7,000. More than 7,000 people who have recovered. Again, if we look at the big picture, 7,200 people who have recovered, and then 126 people who are right now in ICU. So every person that dies or suffers from this virus, it's terrible, it's a tragedy, and it's heartbreaking. And I would never suggest that we take that not fully and completely seriously. But it's also important to look at the number of people who have recovered and remember that overall, the vast majority of people who have contracted this are doing okay and are getting better and healthy, and we need to be thankful for that.
So I want to, sorry, Amir, I want to touch one of the points that you've mentioned. Since you've mentioned your brother being a doctor, I wonder if you can tell our viewers how the Israeli healthcare system is different from what we know here in America.
Oh, I can talk for hours about that because I've had a lot of experiences with American hospitals. My wife gave birth to our first child, a baby daughter, just 3 weeks ago. And before that, we had all kinds of adventures with American hospitals. All of them ended very well, but the healthcare systems are completely different. In Israel, we have basically universal healthcare. There is no such thing as, requiring a private insurance for the most simple interactions like seeing your family doctor or, any kind of hospitalization, because you are basically covered by the law in Israel that gives every citizen universal healthcare. And all the issue of the premiums and that kind of stuff is just not relevant. We don't live in that kind of world. People in Israel don't think twice about getting medical care, at least the basic levels of it, because of insurance issues. And when you go to see your family doctor, you don't pay, or you don't get a bill later to your home. Of course, there are a lot of procedures and things that are more advanced and complicated where people do use private insurances. And the system in Israel is not a completely socialist healthcare system. I would say there are socialist remnants of it, and it's mostly things that stayed since the 1950s when the system was built in Israel. And back then it really was a socialist kind of economy. Those are the days of Ben Gurion and the Labor Party. And then next to it, you have a private healthcare system that does exist in Israel, where if people can pay more money, they will get sometimes easier access to a specialist, faster route to get a surgery, second opinion about something that they got in the general system and they want another expert to look at it. And so those two systems exist next to each other. Neither of them is perfect. There are a lot of problems in the Israeli hospitals. And in general, the way I like to compare it when I talk about my own experiences in American hospitals, and trust me, when my wife and I go to Israel, we've been here in the US for 3 years. That's when I started working for Haaretz here in Washington. Every time we go to visit in Israel and meet with our friends and family, there is a lot of talk about healthcare and hospitals because it's really one of the issues where you can see the differences between the two countries. So many of my Israeli friends, when I tell them about the conditions that my wife and I have experienced at American hospitals, they actually become jealous. Even if we tell them about what the kind of room my wife had before the delivery, or the kind of room that we had after my wife had a surgery 2 years ago, and all kinds of things that have to do more with comfort. Many of my Israeli friends are jealous. But then I remind them that in Israel, maybe you don't have all of these luxuries in a lot of the hospitals, but at the same time, you're never going to be in a situation where if you lose your job, you can basically die in the street because you don't have healthcare. And they say, oh, right. Because healthcare, I think, is a much bigger thing than just the hospital care you receive. A lot of it also, in my opinion, is mental and psychological. In Israel, if you have a job that you don't like and your boss is mean and you hate what you're doing and you feel that you're being disrespected at work, you can just quit your job and you don't even have to find a new one for a while and you will not lose your health care because you have insurance from the state. Here in America, I think people are much more dependent on their workplace because if they lose their job or quit just for whatever reason, they can lose their health insurance and their entire family can lose their health insurance. I think that adds a level of stress that I, as an Israeli, cannot imagine and living with permanently. So two very different systems. When it comes to the coronavirus, however, I think the issue of how to deal with it is pretty similar. I hear every day what my brother tells me, the experiences he has in the hospital, and then I go and read some of the accounts of doctors that have come out of New York and other cities in America. Not very different, the same challenges, the same stories. Luckily, and this makes me very happy, and I thank God every day, in my brother's hospital, they have not witnessed a shortage of protective equipment for the staff. Extremely important. Some hospitals in Israel have experienced that situation where there is not enough equipment to protect the staff and keep them safe. And I know that in America, that has been a really, really big concern, a really, really big problem. So that's maybe one kind of point where you see the systems in the same place. And then, of course, one other issue that is really, really important and nobody has a real answer for is how do we keep the current situation under control? And this is going to be the next dilemma for Israel and practically, I think, also for many places in the United States. As I said, if you look at the numbers in Israel, overall the trend looks good. The numbers are going down. It seems that it's under control. But how do you keep it that way? Because right now there are a lot of restrictions in place on the Israeli economy, and not just on the economy, on society. Remember what I talked about 15 minutes ago? People not being able to go to the cemeteries on Yom HaZikaron. It's insane. It's never happened before. How do you continue with that kind of reality? And I hear more and more from family and friends in Israel that people are less respecting the, the dictates coming out of the government. They are less patient for it. I think part of it has to do with some kind of lever that was broken during Passover, because what happened is before Passover, the government put all the restrictions, telling people you're not allowed to visit your parents, you're not allowed to host your family and friends, you have to stay home with your immediate family, you're not allowed to drive. And then we saw that both Prime Minister Netanyahu and President Rivlin, the two official heads of the country, broke the rules and had family members who don't live with them under the same roof attend their Seder dinners. And after that, I heard from people, by the way, not because of political affiliation, right-wingers, left-wingers, it's not an issue of who you voted for. People just said, you know what, if the heads of the state, the president and the prime minister don't respect these instructions, why should I respect other instructions? For example, there was an instruction in Israel that you're not allowed to do sports activity in a distance of more than 500 meters from your home. That's about, I think, maybe, I don't know, just like 200-300, just like a very short distance from your house. So people said, wait a second, if the government itself is breaking other rules, why do I have to listen to this? I want to run 10 kilometers. I run alone, I stay away from other people, I don't talk to anyone, I keep distance. Why shouldn't I be able to run 10 kilometers? And you started seeing more and more people going out to run in the beaches and in the parks. Of course, you have behaviors that could be more dangerous than running, of people saying, well, if the president or the prime minister or other people in power can break the rules, I actually want to go and visit my grandmother. It's been really hard for me not to see my grandmother for two months. I'm going to visit her. I'll keep a distance. I'll put a mask. People have all kinds of ways to grapple with it. And by the way, maybe what they're doing is actually safe. I just, I cannot judge. But I think as a result, there is more and more pressure coming from the bottom, from the street, from the society to ease the restrictions, and the government is complying a little bit more and more. There is now actually even a discussion about returning to limited school activity in a few days. Maybe not having a full, school day and school week, but learning 2 or 3 days a week in the lower classes, so the parents can go back to work a little bit and have more of a normal reality. And then the question is, how do you keep the virus from spreading? How do you let people go back a little bit more to a sense of normality without having new outbreaks and new crisis points, and then having to go back to reverse the progress you've made and go back to more restrictive policies? Nobody has an answer for that yet. That's the truth, because Israel is going through this process at the same time that other countries are doing it. Germany is easing some restrictions, Denmark, South Korea, Singapore, I think they eased the restrictions and now they're bringing them back. So this is going to be trial and error. There are going to be some more decisions to make life easier for people. And then if, God forbid, we see new outbreaks and new crisis points, there are immediately going to be some kind of reversions back to more restriction. The key factor is testing. That's what all the experts are saying, and to me it makes sense. The key factor is testing. If you can do a high level of tests all the time, you can continue to track whether there are outbreaks or not, and then decide what the policy should be. Another interesting phenomenon we're seeing in Israel is that the coronavirus has really become a huge problem, specifically in one sector of society, which is the ultra-Orthodox community. The one city in Israel that has the highest number of sick people per population is Bnei Brak, which is the biggest ultra-Orthodox city in the country. But there are also hotspots of coronavirus in ultra-Orthodox neighborhoods in Jerusalem and in ultra-Orthodox towns and cities like Modi'in Elit, Beitar Illit, Elad, Bet Shemesh, whereas Tel Aviv, which is the largest city in the country and one of the most dense cities, actually is really having the coronavirus under control and doesn't have as many cases. and also Haifa, which is, the third largest city, not a lot of coronavirus cases. And then some of the satellite cities of Tel Aviv, Ramat Gan, Hulon, Rishon LeZion, also relatively have it under control. But the most difficult outbreaks right now are happening in the ultra-Orthodox community. And this is a real challenge. It's a challenge for the government and for the rabbis and for everyone, how to get this under control and how to stop the spread from returning to the levels that we've already managed to take it down from. So overall, if we're talking, the eve of this Yom HaZikaron, Yom Haatzmaut, as I said, a very strange situation in Israel, unprecedented. Some level of optimism because the numbers show that things are under control and there is a positive trend, and still a lot of uncertainty. How will the return to some economic activity impact the virus? Will we be able to continue to contain it? And also, will the weather help maybe? It's getting hotter in Israel now, it's getting nicer. I get, updates from my parents all the time about what's going on in Tel Aviv. And here in Washington, in the Washington DC area, it's nice, but it's still a little cold, so I'm a bit jealous. And maybe that will also help. But a lot of uncertainty, more questions than answers still at this point. So it's really important that we will keep tracking it and people will continue, even if they go back to more economic activity, to follow guidance like wearing masks in the street, of course, washing your hands, keeping a distance. And maybe if people are serious about that, Israel will be able to both reopen part of the economy and have a good track record of fighting the virus.
So Amir, after all these words, I'm curious, in your perspective, how is the Israeli society going to change in the post-coronavirus era? And I mean change in economics and in culture and in perceptions. I'm really curious.
So, I cannot predict the future. And I think this is a huge question for Israeli society and other societies as well. One thing that my wife has pointed out when all of this started, she said, I don't know how Israelis are going to deal with this social distancing, not because of, not shaking hands and 6 feet and all of those things that are happening in America, but just not hugging. Or as people maybe in the American Jewish community would say it, respecting people's, private space or whatever, because Israelis are big huggers. People hug each other all the time. You don't need to be very close to do it. You don't really need to know the other person to do it. And I think, Israelis can get along very well without the handshakes. We never, that's not a big thing anyway. But not being able to hug other people is really a difficult thing for many Israelis. When are we going to be able to go back to that? I mean, my wife and I are planning to go back to Israel this summer. And, I imagine seeing like all the friends that we haven't seen these many months just because we were here, not because of the virus. And then not giving them a hug, my friends from the military, my friends from, from school. I mean, I cannot imagine it. What are we going to do, this elbow thing? So this is just one element of it. Economically, there is a crisis in Israel right now, like in many other countries. The unemployment level is crazy. It's extremely hard for independents, for people who own small businesses and have really gotten into debt because of it and are losing money every day. And the government has offered some measures of support, in my opinion, far from what is necessary and really very, very not a generous level of support. But the one thing that could really help these businesses, again, is if there is a little more economic activity. I saw that in Germany, they basically decided that small businesses will be able to open before large businesses. In Israel, it's not really been that way. There has been a lot of criticism that IKEA, the huge Swedish furniture company, has been able to open their stores, but my mother's hairdresser cannot open his shop. And I can tell you, by the way, this specific hairdresser, there are a lot of posts on Facebook by mostly women who say that he is an essential business and that he needs to open because it can't go on. For me, it's not an issue, of course, but I can understand why for other people it can be a bit problematic. So, how many of these small businesses will come out of this situation when they're still alive and when they can still function? How many restaurants will shut down? How many hotels? The tourism industry in Israel took a big hit 6 years ago when we had the war in Gaza in 2014. Basically, that summer was canceled. A lot of tourists who were planning to come to Israel that summer didn't come because there were rockets over Tel Aviv and Jerusalem and everything. And 6 years later, once again, the tourism in Israel is taking a huge hit. And this time it's not just tourism from outside, it's also inside the country. People are not traveling. So I think for those businesses, it's going to be extremely hard as well, because to take a second hit like that in 6 years, that's tough. I think the government is going to have to do more to support small businesses and businesses in industries that specifically got hit. And we should just hope, like everyone else in the world, that if the virus gets more under control, and if people learn how to live with it and how to behave and be responsible even while going out, putting masks, keeping a distance, etc., maybe more activity can be renewed and the crisis can somehow begin to end.
There is also another ingredient that in every crisis, there is always someone that earns from the situation. Zoom is one example. And I wonder in Israel, if we're looking on the players in the Israeli arena, I'm talking mainly about the economy, but it can be as anything else. Who are the main earners from the situation?
Well, one person, of course, is Prime Minister Netanyahu, because this has helped him assemble a government that he couldn't do for a year and a half, and now under the crisis, we suddenly have a government. Who else has benefited from it? Maybe our healthcare system, in a weird way, will benefit from it, because for many, many years, the discussion in Israel was all security-oriented. And everybody talked about why we need more tanks and more missiles and more planes and more intelligence gathering abilities and more satellites. Nobody could dispute that because we are surrounded by enemies, etc. But we didn't talk too much about why we need more ventilators, more protective gear for healthcare workers, more disaster training for doctors and nurses, maybe more ambulances. I just don't know what other needs the system could have. Maybe now, because of the virus, there will actually there will be more discussion of those issues as well, and that system will get the support that it needs. That's a big hope, because people have short memories, and that's especially true in a country like Israel, where the news cycle of a day in Israel can be a week in other countries. So maybe 2 months from now, nobody's talking about this anymore, and we're back to Iran, Hezbollah, politics. But I do have some kind of a hope that maybe there will be some kind of a learning process that will lead to more investment in the healthcare system, more support, and making this a top national priority, not something that we just get reminded of when there are crisis points every few years.
I do think that in a way, Israel is dealing with an enemy which is very unfamiliar. I think that many Israelis in their perceptions are used to enemy countries or conflicts with other people, but not something as abstract as a virus that you literally cannot see.
That's true, and by the way, and at the same time, this virus is attacking also our neighbors, and you actually have interesting examples of cooperation between Israel and the Palestinians against the virus. You have, we don't want to have an outbreak of it in the West Bank or in Gaza either. And so you have seen examples of the IDF, allowing Arab countries to send equipment into Gaza, or helping the Palestinians conduct testing in the West Bank and things like that. So once you have this kind of enemy that really doesn't distinguish between a Jew and an Arab, different societies, you actually have to work together to fight it. And there have also been some kind of things that are happening, more behind the scenes between Israel and Arab countries around the equipment, etc. Some things were published about the Mossad getting equipment from Arab countries that would help Israel conduct more tests. So it's fascinating how in an area where people have been fighting each other for so many decades, when you have this kind of enemy that you mentioned, Ophir, the invisible enemy, that is really not distinguishing between people, you actually have these cooperations.
I think there's also another thing worth mentioning, and that is the new heroes, people that were anonymous before the coronavirus, people who are either healthcare officials or experts. We have Moshe Ber Siman Tov, who is the CEO of the healthcare ministry, and we have Professor Yoram Lass, who is an advocate against all the measures that the state is taking place against the coronavirus, and both of them literally became memes. Facebook is
So yeah,
exploding.
yeah. Because, listen, I mean, television is covering this as they would cover a war, and yeah, when you have a war in Israel, you have also like what we call the open studio, where you just they broadcast stupid stuff all day long, completely irrelevant, and they bring experts. Some of them, by the way, I think are experts who are just looking, to get attention, and to be on television. And the more provocative and scary, or provocative and maybe against the trend kind of things you would say, you would get more exposure. Um, I still recommend for people who want to get informed on what is happening to try to read newspapers in print or online more, and to watch cable news television less. I really do believe that by reading, and it can be Haaretz, but it can also be other news sources, but by actually reading articles about this from good news sources, you will be more informed than by watching the, kind of hysterical coverage on the cable news. And that's true in Israel, and it's true in America, honestly.
I wonder what can the United States, and specifically New York City, since most of our followers are New York residents, what can they learn from the way Israel is tackling the virus?
I don't know if at this point in time we can talk about lessons, because I think New York and Israel already had their first virus experiences, and they were extremely different. I think in Israel there were more measures of caution taken early. At the point in time when in New York there was still, life was still going on the same, people were still going to work and going out and having, big gatherings. In Israel, there were already some restrictions put in place, and there was already a sense of fear. Actually, in Israel, I'll tell you something. The sense of fear caused people in Israel to be careful even before the government put restrictions in place. People were already kind of quarantining themselves and limiting their interactions and limiting their exposure opportunities to the virus even before the government came in. And in the weeks before the March 2 Israeli election, the coronavirus was controlling the headlines in Israel. It was really weird. We had an election on March 2nd, but if you looked at the top news websites in Israel a week before the election, all the headlines were about coronavirus. I remember talking to this with friends in the newspaper and said, I don't understand. What is this thing? There's an election next week and all what you're talking about is the virus. They told me people want to read more about the virus. We already had 2 elections before in the same year. People are tired of politics, but the virus is new and interesting. And you could really see that even before the government came in with restrictions, people were already really interested in this story, following it extremely closely, and already putting all kinds of restrictions on themselves and on their families, and trying to limit what they do. Not everyone, of course, but a lot of people. And I think in America it was different. But at the same time that my friends in Israel were already obsessing about the coronavirus and preparing for it, I felt that my friends here in America don't really treat it seriously yet. Don't take it as something that is really going to impact and change their life. And I think that maybe helped Israel weather the storm better than other places because of this preparation. And I also want to say Israel geographically is not in America, of course. It's in the Middle East, between Asia and Europe. So things that were happening in countries like Italy and Spain, Italy and Spain are so close to Israel, 2-3 hour flights. Israelis were actually going to those countries in February, late February. You still had Israelis who were going to Italy and Austria and France, where the virus was already hitting very hard. So that also impacted our response, because when you are closer to those places, you feel that the chance that it will come to your home is larger. Whereas here in America, I think people had some kind of an illusion maybe that the vast ocean in between will protect them.
I do remember that from here, actually, from New York. I live in the East Village, and I remember that during March, when I thought it was necessary to quarantine the society, people were taking business as usual. And I think one of the motives for that is that people want to believe everything will be all right. I value this optimism. I do think it was more necessary to do all the restrictions earlier, but I think it's a test of retrospective. And in retrospective, almost always when we test things, we might fail. But if there is one thing I want to emphasize about the difference between Israel and the United States, if you remember, Amir, in Israel, you actually had people diagnosed with coronavirus, had their initiatory and their route in Israel published in all the newspaper. You could literally
Yes,
know if someone went to the grocery store and then
yes.
to the beach.
One of the early stages that Israel took was what we call tracing, which is if a person was tested and found positive, they would then be interviewed very extensively and they would be asked to basically provide all of the contacts they had, all of the places they visited in recent days, and then that information would be published. It would become public without their name. Um, and then people could look and see if they might have run into this person who is infected and they should check into their own situation. That was, I think, a smart policy. It also had an entertaining element to it because you would have, without people's names, a complete description of what they did. And I remember, and they had numbers on it. You had, infected person number 74, infected person number 202. And people would talk about, oh my God, look at this person's life. It's amazing. They go to the restaurants every day. They go to cafes, parties. Well, what's their life? Why don't I live like that? So, but I think that was helpful, although it also maybe caused some kind of a measure of panic, that people are like, oh my God, I was in the same supermarket 20 hours after this person was there. Do I need to go see a doctor now? It took time for people to understand what is actually valuable information from this and what is not. But yeah, I think it was a good thing that they did, and it helped. I think if there is one place where Israel did not have as much success, it's really in the ultra-Orthodox community, where you see that even after the spread was being contained in Tel Aviv and Haifa and other places, it still spread very, very strongly in the ultra-Orthodox community. And that is one place where I think things could have been done differently. But honestly, I'm not an expert on that society, so I cannot really come and say what should have been done. I just see that that's where we have still an ongoing open crisis.
Of course, and I do think that what you've mentioned with the entertainment figure of how people could literally be jealous of other Israelis who were diagnosed with the coronavirus because of their so-called lifestyle teaches you about the Israeli society a lot, that it's a society of a small community in which almost everyone know or can be connected quite easily to anyone else. I would not imagine that happening in New York City.
Well, I think there's also a privacy element to it. I mean, in Israel, there were also some decisions taken by the government that were very, very controversial around privacy rights that I think never could have been implemented in the United States. There was an initiative by the government to allow the Shin Bet, basically like the FBI, to track the movements of people who have been diagnosed with coronavirus to make sure that they are not breaking the quarantine and to make sure, that all of their contacts have been traced. This was extremely controversial. There were lawsuits about it. It got to the Supreme Court, and there were Knesset committees about it. People warned that it could lead to dictatorship. I think, by the way, a completely on-point criticism. I think it's really dangerous to use the powers of the state in such a way, but at the same time, I could understand where the motivation came from, and I think the problem was the level of oversight, right? This kind of power, when you give it to the state, you need to have really good oversight of how it's being used. And that's also what the Supreme Court eventually said. They said the government can use those technologies to track citizens, but there has to be strong oversight over it. So it's a really complicated situation. And yeah, I think some of the things that were adopted in Israel would not have worked here in the United States, where people view privacy in a very, very strict manner.
I think if there is one lesson that we can learn from this is that in treating the pandemic, we need to remember the cultural differences and sensitivities. I think that because we are one global community at the end of the day, we should remember that what's relevant to New York City is not relevant to Miami or LA or Washington, D.C., at least not in 100%. And I think that also it's a chance to get together with people, even not physically. I think that the very existence of Zoom sessions and events like this, we also had the Holocaust Memorial, and people were on Zoom for for Zikaron Basalon, for personal testimonies. And even now, I know that there are ceremonies of Yom HaZikaron and following that celebrations of Yom Haatzmaut in Zoom. So I think there's something charming about it. Without, despite all the disadvantages, there is something charming about this.
Well, yes, I will say, I wrote an article about a week ago about how Jewish day schools in America are dealing with the pandemic. And I interviewed school principals in New York and Atlanta and Washington, D.C. and other places. This was published on Haaretz.com a week ago. And one of the principals said something I really, really liked. He said that he doesn't agree with the term social distancing. He said we really need physical distancing right now. People have to stay 6 feet apart at least, and no gatherings, and don't visit your grandma, everything. Physical distancing. But he said we don't need social distancing. Actually, we need social togetherness. We need people to communicate with each other. Yes, from a distance. And if possible, technologically much, much better. Zoom, Facebook, WhatsApp, you name it. But don't socially distance yourself, physically distance yourself, but socially stay in touch. Talk to your friends, talk to your family, maybe talk to other people that you can somehow, meet through different forums, communicate. It's really important. And I totally agree. And that's why I'm happy, Ophir, that you had this initiative to do this event today. The more of these, I think the better.
Absolutely. I think that your insights as someone who experienced both cultures as a correspondent here and as a born and raised Israeli is a very important perspective that people should learn more about. I also think that what you've said about the difference between physical distancing and social distancing is the core issue. I think that while we should distance ourselves physically, we should get together to people and open up. And this is actually not socially distancing, it's socially gathering, but not in a physical form, in an emotional form. I would call it social resilience. I would call it social solidarity. And if there is one key ingredient in being independent, in being individual, and I'm saying independent on purpose because Yom Haatzmaut is also emerging, is also being part of a community and really contribute what you have in yourself. And I think that the current circumstances are the best chance to do so.
Amen. I like that.
I think on that turn, we'll finish our conversation. It was a tremendous pleasure, Amir.
It's my pleasure. Thank you so much, Ophir, for initiating this, and to everyone who helped make it happen, and of course, to everyone who joined and listened. And please stay safe, stay healthy, take good care of yourself, take this seriously, and at the same time, communicate and talk to people. Let's just all hope that in a few weeks, things both in Israel and here will be in a much better situation.
Amen to that. And I want to thank the Arts and Culture Department of the Foreign Ministry Y, wonderful, wonderful group of people, and the marketing department that enabled this event happening. And stay tuned for more events, more of our outreach to you. We'd love to stay in touch, and it's been a pleasure. Have a great evening.